Hi everyone. Just a few quick notes before we jump into today's video. Just as I finished up this video, Elon made some comments at Giga Berlin that related closely to what's covered in this video, and it pretty much aligns with what I'm saying based on what I've seen in the news. Let's listen to what Elon said, I'll give a few thoughts, and then we'll move on to the main video itself.
Last year there were a lot of supply chain challenges with chips. Everyone knows about the chip shortage. And then this year there's still some chip shortages. And then next year will be, I think, probably a challenge with total battery production. And then certainly if you start going like 2-3 years out, it's all about total, how many gigawatt hours of battery are produced. That will be the limiting factor. And then going even further down into the supply chain, what is the rate at which battery materials are being mined and refined? And obviously we want to do that in an ethical and environmentally sensitive way. So that in the long grand scheme of things is how many terawatt hours of battery can be produced per year.
Now, as usual, what Elon said could be parsed a few different ways. When he speaks off the cuff, he can't speak 100% precisely, and it's open to a little bit of interpretation, but this was fairly clear. So the first thing is, he said 2022 is going to be all about the chips, and we've discussed that in past videos. But next year, it's going to return to total battery production as the limiting factor. In 2024 to 2025, he said it's all about gigawatt hours produced. Now, what's the difference between total gigawatt hours produced in 2024 to 2025 and what he was saying about total battery production next year? I think the differentiating factor there is raw materials. And I think that's why Elon, at the end of what he said there, tacked on a few words about the importance of mining and refining in a responsible way. The bulk of this video discusses exactly that, raw materials and supply chain challenges. Now, Elon's comments were hugely useful to me because it gives us an indication of when Tesla's raw materials runway is starting to taper a bit. And as I explain in this video, it doesn't mean Tesla's growth will stop. It just means unless something drastic is done, the growth rate will taper. Now, that growth rate tapering can be mitigated somewhat by switching to vehicles with smaller battery packs, like a Model 2 or Model Q, whatever you feel like calling it. Elon did make another comment on growth, and let's try to circle that square. He said that Tesla has been averaging about a 70 to 80% growth rate. All right, that's clear. But he said, well, there's a potential for a greater than 70 to 80% growth rate in the future. Now, does he mean the near future or the far future? Because as far as I'm concerned, if Tesla, this year and next year are Tesla's best chances at increasing their growth rate beyond 70 to 80%, if that's possible, which Elon clearly thinks it is possible. After that, 2024, 2025, at least from a vehicle production standpoint, I don't see a growth rate of beyond 70 to 80%. It just gets incrementally harder as the decade goes on. However, he could be referring to profit. Now, I see multiple potential shots on goal for Tesla to increase their profit by beyond 70 to 80% as the decade moves along. It's just the vehicles, 2024, 2025, I find it hard to see a growth rate of even 70 to 80% as we enter the middle of the decade. With that, let's kick into the video. Oh, and one more note. Apologies for the poor lighting later in the video. After I noticed that, I upgraded the lights in this room to give it a bit more pop. It was a little bit too yellow in the background. Now we got a nice clean white background for you. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jordan Giesecke, and this is The Limiting Factor. I've been teasing for a few months now that I'm going to start doing videos on news or news roundups, and that starts today. I'm going to start giving my views on trends I see in battery news, as well as my views on technology announcements. Today, I'll be covering Panasonic's 4680 battery cell and other variations on the 4680 battery cell from other manufacturers. Plus, the massive changes that I'm seeing in the battery raw materials market and what that what the implications are for Tesla and other companies in the battery space. Let's get right into it. The first news theme is Panasonic's 4680 battery cells. Now, the image that I'm putting on screen was compiled from about between 4 to 6 different news articles, and there was some conflicting information between those news articles. I compiled that as best I could and injected a bit of my own logic and understanding to make something, to make a timeline. The first thing to note is that Kazuo Tadanubo, who is the CEO of Panasonic Energy, made some comments about the difficulties of producing the 4680 battery cell. He said it's taken an immense amount of stamina and that changing the cell's shape required considerable nerve. So when you see other companies promoting their 4680 battery cells, just bear in mind that Panasonic is one of the most advanced cell manufacturers in the world. They have some of the best engineers. So if it's difficult for them and it's taking them several years for them to get the 4680 going, then how difficult is it for other companies that don't have as much expertise? And how amazing is it that Tesla has started production with a battery cell that is difficult even for the incumbents to execute on? Panasonic is currently starting test production in Wakayama, Japan, and it's rumored to be about 10 gigawatt hours. Once again, this is test production or a pilot line. Now, that's exactly the number of gigawatt hours that Tesla has installed at Cato Road in California. Now, I don't think that this means that Panasonic is using Tesla's DBE or dry battery electrode coating process for their electrodes. I'm assuming they're still using a wet process. What has changed, of course, is the form factor. They're moving from 2170 to 4680. Now, along with that, my assumption is that they would have to be using a tabless electrode to make that work. And it's probably why it's not so easy just to shift from 2170 to 4680, because there must be some new technology in there. And that new technology, my guess, is the tabless electrode. Another thing that came out in the articles was that these battery cells achieve 15% greater energy density than Panasonic's current cells. Those current cells are about 260 to 270 watt-hours per kilogram, meaning that the 4680 version of the battery cells will be about 300 watt-hours per kilogram. Now that's interesting because 300 watt-hours per kilogram is exactly what Elon's been teasing for Tesla's in-house 4680 battery cell. So it looks like most of the energy density improvements come from the larger form factor and the tabless electrode, which reduces resistance, which reduces losses through heat. Now, Panasonic expects to be toying around with that test line for about a year, and they expect to hit volume production in 2023. At the latest, they want to hit volume production by March of 2024. The articles also stated that Panasonic intends to do some 4680 cell production in the US, and they're targeting Oklahoma or Kansas. There was no mention of Nevada, which I find interesting. I'm not sure if that means they no longer plan on expanding at Giga Nevada, or they plan on doing both expansion at Giga Nevada as well as a new battery cell factory in Oklahoma or Kansas. Now, of course, besides Panasonic, pretty much every battery cell manufacturer is making their own version of the 4680 battery cell. However, the company that I got the most questions about was, I believe it's an Israeli company called StoreDot. StoreDot stuck their chemistry in 4680 battery cells and was able to get a 10-minute charge rate. However, from my perspective, the 4680 part was kind of a gimmick. As Elon often says, prototypes are easy and production is hard. I'm not sure if the image on screen is a render or a real photo. If it's real, this still isn't volume production, which is millions of cells per day. Although StoreDot's 4680 is gimmicky, to me at least, I don't see any reason to doubt their 10-minute charge claim. I don't have anything against the company, and I'm interested to see them hit their target of mass production by 2024. But I am wondering if there are any handicaps that go along with that 10-minute charge rate, such as, for instance, a hit to energy density, or if the battery cells are more expensive to produce. With regards to Tesla's 4680 battery cells, I won't be covering those in this video because I've been covering the 4680 battery cell progress after each Tesla quarterly earnings call. So expect to hear more about that in about a month. Moving on to the second news theme, which is the crunch in battery raw materials. As Elon Musk has said on Twitter, Tesla is seeing significant raw material price inflation. Now, if Tesla is starting to feel it and they're one of the most well-prepared, largest players in the game, I can't imagine how this is affecting legacy auto manufacturers that are trying to ramp their battery cell supply, or even newer EV manufacturers like Lucid. The raw material price inflation that Elon is referring to here is happening for every raw material for batteries, but most distinctly for lithium. Yes, there was a massive surge in nickel, but that was in large part due to a short squeeze. Based on this slide from a Lithium America slide deck, things look pretty dire. However, there are two things worth keeping in mind. First, Tesla has long-term contracts in place, so they wouldn't be feeling the full brunt of these price increases. Second, Tesla has been increasing the price of their vehicles beyond what would most likely be required to cover the material's price inflation, and they still have a wait time for Model Y of almost a year, so they could raise their prices even further. Tesla isn't impervious to battery cost, but so far, they're weathering the inflation well. What actually concerns me here is that we may be seeing just the beginning of a squeeze in raw materials. If we look more long-term, we can see that for all raw materials combined, demand is estimated to exceed supply in 2022 and only get more undersupplied from there. This is still enough for about 30 million vehicles a year in 2030, but it's far short of what the potential demand could be in 2030, which is about 60 million vehicles a year. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't mean that raw material supply and cell supply will just freeze and we'll hit a ceiling where we can't produce any more battery cells. We will continue to see incremental increases in battery cell supply. But it's likely that most of that battery cell supply is going to be going to Tesla and Chinese companies. And this is because China controls most of the supply chain, and Tesla has been working on their supply chain for about a decade. And we'll come back to that later in the video. The third news theme follows on from the raw materials story. Battery cell prices are increasing drastically due to the raw material shortages. For example, LFP is now 5% over the cost of nickel battery cells in China. Now that's a massive change because LFP is usually about 20% cheaper than nickel-based battery cells. This article is from Benchmark Minerals, but I've seen other analyst houses confirm this information. As for view for all battery chemistries, BNEF, which is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, does a survey each year, and for 2021, they found that battery prices nearly flatlined. And that's before the raw materials prices started surging. So I'm interested to see how this pans out for their 2022 pricing survey. The early indications I've seen are that battery cell prices will increase across the board. So, at a high level, what do the current raw material shortages, increased cell prices, high oil prices, and the general inflation of all goods mean for battery cells? For the first 2 years of the channel, I was focused on battery cell cost, and the raw materials were relatively plentiful. Now, in my view, that's flipped on its head. It's all about securing as many units of raw materials and battery cells as possible, and cost is a secondary concern. I see two broad situations that EV manufacturers find themselves in. First, those like Tesla who can increase the price of their vehicles due to extreme demand. Second, EV manufacturers who are still losing money on their EVs and are faced with the choice of either losing more money on those EVs or shutting down their EV programs. This is game theory in full effect. Tesla was the first Western company serious about EVs, and now they're in a position where they're both profitable and have nearly unlimited demand and can raise prices. Now, some of you might bring up this image from ARK Invest. I have a lot of respect for ARK, but for the time being, this isn't an accurate reflection of reality because it doesn't take into account geopolitical realities. Rather, it seems the assumptions in this model are built around an ideal version of reality. And, everything works in PowerPoint, but quite often, things are more complex than that. Battery prices, as I said a moment ago, are increasing rather than falling, despite scale increasing. I don't know if that means battery prices will keep increasing, whether battery prices will remain flat, and when the battery prices will start dropping again. I'm not in a position to know this, but I think at least it's worth taking a sober look at what's going on in the raw materials markets and considering it. In time, battery prices will drop to the levels shown here, but for now at least, reality is diverging from the models. With the backdrop of the broader raw materials and pricing dynamics in place, let's look at a piece of news that's a bit more positive, which is Tesla's succession of raw materials agreements. To get into the details of all these agreements would take its own video, so this will just be a high-level overview. Only one of these deals is with a major producer, which is lithium from Ganfeng. Tesla already buys lithium from Ganfeng. For this new deal, we don't know the size of the deal, but it's probably the largest and most reliable of the deals that were publicized. As a side note, the deals shown here aren't necessarily every deal that Tesla would have signed in the past few months. They're just the deals that showed up on my radar. And it's also worth noting that a number of the deals that Tesla signed may have been commercial in confidence, so they may not even have shown up in the media even though they signed those deals. Besides the Ganfeng deal, the rest of the deals are with smaller or newer producers that are in varying states of progress on their mines. That is, the supply is less reliable in terms of production date and quantity. All said and done, these smaller deals amount to enough raw materials to supply vehicle production in the low to mid hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year, or about 10 to 50 gigawatts. That's not to say these agreements aren't important. I mentioned the number of vehicles that can be produced with these materials to give you a flavor of Tesla's strategy for raw materials. In the past, Tesla has only worked with the largest players in the game. Now that material supply is becoming tight and Tesla is starting their own in-house production, they appear to be branching out a bit. In my view, the most noteworthy of these agreements is the nickel supply deal with Talon Metals. Talon intends on producing clean nickel locally here in the U.S. This is exactly the type of nickel that Tesla wants to encourage. Tesla rarely, if ever, comments on material supply agreements that they've signed, but they made an exception with Talon. Drew Baglino of Tesla provided a quote for the press release. Quote, "The Talon team has taken an innovative approach to the discovery, development, and production of battery materials, including to permanently store carbon as part of the mining operations and the investigation of the novel extraction of battery materials. Responsible sourcing of battery materials has long been a focus for Tesla, and this project has the promise to accelerate the production of sustainable energy products in North America." End quote. There is, of course, quite a bit of nickel supply coming online in Indonesia, but that nickel supply is less environmentally friendly, and I suspect Tesla will try to avoid it as much as possible. The last thing worth noting about the agreements that Tesla is signing is that all of these mines are being monitored by the likes of Benchmark Minerals and Ark Equity. That is, there's nothing actually new here. It's just confirmation of where those battery materials are going to for the resources that were already known. I say this because some people are doubtful that graphs like this are accurate, and that raw materials in mines will spontaneously erupt into the market by surprise. It doesn't work like that. The fifth and final news theme that we'll cover today is the battle over mining. Intercalation Station provided a great summary of some of the difficulties being encountered by lithium mines in Nevada, Chile, and Serbia. This is a huge amount of lithium supply that's being curtailed or potentially curtailed. For example, the 60,000 tons of lithium carbonate in Nevada is enough for about 85 gigawatt hours of batteries. Chile has the largest reserves of lithium in the world and is the second largest supplier of lithium for batteries. The Serbian mine was to account for 27% of Europe's lithium supply by 2030. If all the planned mines in developed countries get shut down by actions like these, then China's pretty much going to have, or their monopoly will continue into the future as battery materials become even more important to economies. So strategically, it's not good for Western countries when these mines get shut down or curtailed. However, There are some politicians and people out there who recognize what a strategic threat this is, and they're starting to take some action. So let's cover that news. Starting with Europe. My read of the news is that so far, Parliament has agreed on a report titled A European Strategy for Critical Materials that contains an action plan. I don't know how the European bureaucracy works, but in my experience with bureaucracy, someone actually needs to action the action plan. I'll keep my eyes peeled for more information, or if somebody understands this legislation better than I do, make a note in the comments below. In the U.S., there's a bipartisan push from senators for the president to invoke the Defense Production Act for battery raw materials. I don't know the scope of the Defense Production Act and how it could be used to accelerate mining and materials production, but it's good to know that there's pressure building. Now, I've been saying for about 18 months that the future of our battery raw materials and battery cell supply rests on permitting and regulation. That's the key bottleneck. And, well, that future has become the present really quickly. In fact, the situation has deteriorated much more quickly than I expected. Now, it's of course not all doom and gloom. Let's recap and summarize on everything that was discussed today to get a bit of perspective and get a view on how all these things fit together. There were 5 themes. First, Panasonic is working on their own version of the 4680 battery cell. Now, as I said in my lithium-mined battery line series in 2020, I said there's no reason why Panasonic couldn't create a 4680 battery cell, but that it would take them several years to get there because of the difficulties inherent in producing the tabless electrode. And that's exactly what we're seeing. The 4680 was unveiled in 2020, September of 2020, and Panasonic intends to start producing those 4680 battery cells in-house in volume in 2023, with March 2024 being their drop-dead date. Second, there's a crunch in battery raw materials with no end in sight. This is going to severely limit EV production in the coming decade, and robo-taxis will become of paramount importance if we want to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. The third theme was that the battery material shortages are driving battery material prices higher, which in turn drives up the price of battery cells themselves. Even typically low-cost LFP battery cells are being sold for the same price as high-nickel battery cells, and typically those LFP battery cells are about 20% cheaper rather than being the same price or 5% more expensive. The primary goal for OEMs no longer seems to be driving battery costs below $100 per kilowatt hour. That is important, but it seems to become secondary importance. The goal is to hoover up every gram of battery material and every cell possible, because without them, you can't make an EV. The impact of this will vary by manufacturer. Chinese companies and Tesla are profitable and can raise their prices. Many other EV makers aren't producing EVs profitably and don't have the reputation or demand to increase their prices. So this doesn't bode well for them. The fourth theme is that Tesla is signing a rapid succession of battery supply agreements. They're signing agreements with every company they can, large or small, to line up the materials they need for in-house battery cell production. Compared to the amount of materials Tesla will need, the quantities reported in these agreements only cover a fraction of Tesla's needs. However, we don't know the details of all of Tesla's contracts, and it's a good sign nonetheless, and it gives Tesla a chance to boost the signals of companies it appears to prefer, such as Talon Metals. Fifth, and finally, environmentalists are choking the supply of battery materials that are necessary to transition the world to sustainable energy. Fate loves irony. Politicians are trying to get the gears in motion to create more local mining and materials production, and I'll be keeping an eye on how that pans out. Overall, my view is that mining done in advanced economies will have reduced environmental impact compared to mining done in developing countries. We can either do it in our own backyard as cleanly as possible, or take advantage of poorer and more desperate countries with weaker regulations. Overall, I'm optimistic that at least a portion of the mining and battery material supply chain will be built in the US and Europe. But the more the better. I think the world is starting to see the foolishness of outsourcing production on strategic materials. Let's hope that lights a fire under legislatures. Finally, how does all this affect my guesses for the number of battery cells Tesla will be consuming over the coming decade? In my predictions, I suggested 3 growth phases. Between 2020 and 2023, I figured an average growth rate of about 65% per year. Then, as material shortages hit from 2023 to 2026, I was expecting an average growth rate of about 42% per year. However, the vehicle business would grow quicker than that because those vehicles in the mid-2020s will be using smaller battery packs. Finally, I suggested that if the politics around mining changes and red tape was cut, that growth could resume at 50% per year for the rest of the decade. That was a Hail Mary on my part. I was hoping that would happen, and I still hope that would happen. But if it doesn't, we may see pretty flat growth in battery materials and electric vehicles in the second half of the decade. Overall, I think the basic hypothesis I laid out here is generally correct, but rather than viewing it as a middle-of-the-road estimate, which was my goal when I created it, I'm now viewing it as more of an aggressive estimate because, as I've said, things are changing more quickly than I expected. Raw material shortages started a year earlier than I expected, which affects growth between now and the middle of the decade. There's still a giant question mark as to whether Western countries will move fast enough to permit mines. They need to be doing that now if we're going to have those materials in the second half of the decade. Generally, mines take at least 6 years to bring to production. So, as I said a moment ago, the permitting and mining push really needs to happen now. Regardless, I'll be very interested to see if Elon puts raw materials and mining as part of his Master Plan Part 3. Generally, Elon puts products into the master plan rather than things that aren't customer-facing like mining. But if there was a time for Tesla to make a push into mining, now is the time. And this recent tweet from Elon may suggest Tesla is getting deeper into mining. Scaling to extreme size requires ridiculous quantities of materials. So I'm waiting excitedly to see if mining makes it into the master plan. Now, the news themes that I covered today were only a fraction of the information that I collected over the past 6 months. There will be another video covering other things, like, for instance, technology and technology developments. However, that may be a month or two before that comes out, because what we have coming up soon is I have to do another deep dive video, because I want to try to continue doing one deep dive video a month. And then there's Giga Austin grand opening, which I intend on going to. And there's the Tesla Q1 earnings call, and I'm going to have to do a video on that. So that's pretty much the next 6 weeks booked up. So look for another video like this in about 2 months. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon with the link at the end of the video or as a YouTube member. You can find the details in the description.